further ado, I want to give you a little info on our guest speaker tonight, Brother Gene Andrews. He was scheduled to be here last year for the conference, and due to several things, that didn't, no fault of his, but we didn't have the conference last year. But I can tell you now, this is going to be the biggest and best conference that we ever had. Yes, sir. And there's a big announcement coming about that conference here in maybe in the February meeting, if not before. This is going to be a real special conference for several reasons. So keep that in mind. But Brother Gene was born in Nashville, Tennessee, and on the battlefield, part of the Nashville battlefield. Grew up there, and I know probably a lot of us had relatives or kin on that battlefield. I know I had two great great-granddaddies on that battlefield there that day. One of them ended up in Dent Prison in Louisville, Kentucky, from Nashville, and lived 1 month and died and was buried there in Louisville. He played football and run track in high school. His senior track season, he broke the Tennessee state record in the 440-yard dash. But the two runners who finished ahead of him also broke the state record. So when I was reading that, I said, man, that's just hard luck there. But close but no cigar. He went to college on a track scholarship. He went through the Marine Corps, officer boot camp, was commissioned and served as a lieutenant with the 3rd Marine Division in Vietnam. Province, the Quang Tri province in 1969. Returning to the States, Gene played football for the Quantico Marines and was invited to the Cincinnati Bengals rookie and free agent camp in 1970. He played 2 seasons of minor league football before teaching history and coaching football and track in high school. Gene worked for his brother's motorsports medicine company, taking care of drivers and crew members in IndyCar. He is retired now, but pretty much full-time as a caretaker of the Nathan Bedford Forrest Boyhood Home. I know most of us has probably visited there at some time or other. He's going to bring it to life for you here tonight. Have you got any of your books left? 2 left. We want him to leave here empty-handed. And now you wonder about AI. That's amazing what he's got back there. And Brother Gene is going to talk with us. It's a little bit different for Lee Jackson. I know that Tyrone has got something planned. You've got a poem about General Lee, and we're going to call on you at this time to come forward with that, Tyrone.
Good evening, compatriots. It's a pleasure to be here with you to honor 2 of the greatest Confederates, Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee. How's that? Is that good, Ed? Everybody? The poem I will read in a moment was written 19 years ago this month by compatriot Joseph Cecil Wingard, a high school teacher from Andalusia, who passed away in December 2017 and is buried 10 miles west of here at the Coosa River Primitive Baptist Church. He wrote the poem in honor of the Lee Bicentennial in January 2007, and it has been my honor to read it at several Lee Jackson dinners since that time. Compatriot Wingard himself read us this poem in 2007 at a Lee Jackson dinner in Montgomery. Was anyone else there at that time? She was, my wife. So I will now introduce and read the poem Lee at Jacksonville in homage to compatriot Wingard, who wrote it. In the last year of his life, at the urging of family, doctors, and the board of directors of Washington College, which he headed, Robert E. Lee took a 2-month trip through the coastal states of the South in the hope of improving his failing health. The trip did nothing to improve his health. In fact, it may have hastened his death by a few months because of all the attention he got everywhere he went. But it was nonetheless a glorious period of his last days. Everywhere he went, he was thronged by excited and adoring crowds of people of all ages. He made his way first to North Carolina, where at White Sulphur Springs he visited the grave of his daughter Annie. She had died there when she was young. He had been unable to be present in August 1866 because he was being prosecuted by the federal government, when the local people dedicated a modest monument in Annie's honor. From Annie's gravesite, he journeyed on to South Carolina and Georgia, finally coming to Savannah, and from there he went by boat to visit the grave of his father on Cumberland Island. His father, as I imagine you know, was Light Horse Harry Lee, the Revolutionary soldier. From there, he proceeded to Jacksonville, Florida, where his boat, the Nick King, was met by more excited crowds, all of whom wanted to meet him, say a word to him, or shake his hand. So many people came aboard that they almost swamped the boat, the Nick King, while others stood along the quay, disappointed that they couldn't come aboard. Finally, Lee was asked to go from the lounge where he was receiving those who had gotten on board up onto the deck so that he could be seen by all the people. Everywhere he had gone, he had been met by frenzied cheering. But that day, when he stepped onto the deck and took off his hat, the crowd fell into a reverent silence. Here's where the poem takes up the description. The old man stood on the anchored ship, but not a cheer cleared a southern lip. They'd called for Lee and streamed aboard to see the man that the South adored. They'd almost swamped at St. John's Quay the barge of the God who had come their way. And those on shore had pushed and cried to see their Lee before they died. They'd heard in Jacksonville past noon that the Nick King would be landing soon. They'd run and limped and gathered there to see the man who had been their prayer. They cheered and shouted, called, huzzahed, to get a glimpse, to prompt a nod. And he, to grant their heartfelt call, their Lee appeared before them all. The April sun his white hairs crowned as silently he stood his ground. His form erect through that long war was bowed by age, by sadness more. No vanity, no hidden rage had left its crease upon his age. A Christian soul, forgiving all, determined to transcend his fall. A gentleman to the very core, he led in peace as he led in war. A simple man, a simple heart, who knew no more than do his part. A Christ without a cross was he, and all the South his Calvary. A hush upon the crowd ensued. No cheer was heard, no calls renewed. The only sound's the lapping wave, the little song some wild bird gave. A silence as of church and grave fell over all. There stood the cause. The smallest child knew it should pause, and looking up to find out why, saw tears within his father's eye. A soldier touched his empty sleeve. None dared to stir, none dared to leave. A cripple used his son to brace and wiped his arm across his face. A mother in her faded gown clasped close the ring on her dead son found. Another looked at her little son Lee, named as many a son would be. The memories of defeat, disgrace, the ruined homes, the tattered lace, the loss of father, loss of son, husband, brother, one by one. Insults and thefts and oh much more no Southern heart had known before. The loss of keepsakes, precious things, their pictures, books, and marriage rings. Men lost and buried, God knows where, without a marker or a prayer. No heart escaped the plunging knife that ripped the South and took its life. A common bond pervaded all, but not a shout, no, not a call. The hardest trembled at his mouth, for there stood Lee, there stood the South. And the silence rang like a golden bell for the man who'd done his duty well, who'd left his home and his bright career and risked it all for the ones most dear. And to those who hear these feeble lines, I hope that silence your own heart finds. For on that day on a Florida coast, silence was cheers from an awestruck host. And men were mute by a silent sea as they stood before General Robert Edward Lee.
Without further ado, let's welcome Brother Gene. Pat couldn't be here tonight. She's gone to the rodeo in Fort Worth with her son. Has carried him to Fort Worth. But she hated to miss this man right here, and he spoke at the Forest Party a couple of times, I'm pretty sure. But Gene, come on around.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation being here, and thank you for the great meal and all the ladies that served that. And it's always great to be with a crowd of Southerners. It's almost like you're having a big family reunion. Doesn't matter whether you're from Alabama, Tennessee, North Carolina, wherever, we have that common bond together. So our program tonight is about General Nathan Bedford Forrest. And I think he was one of the most brilliant natural commanders in American history. Probably Forrest and Geronimo were the two greatest natural warriors that fought in this country. So I'd like to give you some information on that. Our program is entitled Forrest Strategy If They'd Only Listen. And all the reading I've done on Forrest, one theme kept coming up over and over again. It seemed that he had a clear idea of what needed to be done on the battlefield. He advised his commanding officers, they didn't listen, we lost. Then he even wrote to Richmond, to the War Department, and then got nothing from them, and then wrote directly to President Davis, got nothing again. So I think there's a chance that we could have had our Southern independence if we'd fought a little bit different strategy. Now I know the War Department thought, and this is not taking anything away from General Lee, but they thought if Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia could just crush the Army of the Potomac in one great battle, destroy them, march on Washington and threaten Washington, and put the artillery up on the heights there where Arlington Cemetery is now, lob a few shells in at the White House or the Capitol building or the War Department or the Navy Yard, that would convince His Holiness Saint Abraham the Pious to give us our independence. And weren't able to do that. And they won a lot of battles, but they couldn't destroy the Federal Army to make a move on Washington. They had the chance after the first Manassas, but then didn't do it. Anyway, I think Forrest had a better idea of the type of warfare that the South needed to wage. So as Southerners despair to see more and more of our once beautiful Southland overrun by illegals from alien locations such as Mexico, Central America, and Middle Eastern terrorists, and far western terrorists from California and places like Michigan and so forth and so on, we ask ourselves, what would have happened to us had we won our war for Southern independence in 1861 to 65? Well, it didn't happen. And even Southern historians have bravely defended the efforts of our boys by stating it wasn't so amazing that they lost, it's amazing that they held out for 4 years. And various turning points are given like Gettysburg or Vicksburg or the fall of Atlanta. But I think there was, well, people say, well, it was hopeless. They just couldn't fight a war of 9 million against 21 million and a Navy and all the things we had to go up against. But it wasn't hopeless. I don't think so. The South had one officer in the field with a very clear vision of the type of warfare that the South needed to fight to win our independence. But it didn't require huge armies or mountains of supplies either. And his tactics were proven successful over and over again. It wasn't just theory. And I'm convinced that the strategy and overall military concepts exhibited by Nathan Bedford Forrest could have won the war for independence for our Southern nation without British intervention, without the huge bloodbaths that the South could not afford to fight, and without the destruction of the economy of the South. Now, a lot of y'all probably already know this. Forrest grew up dirt poor on the frontier. But through extremely hard work and determination, by the time the war cloud spread over the South, he had a net worth of over $1.5 million, which would be about $40 to $50 million today. So Forrest opposed secession, as did Robert E. Lee in Virginia. But like Lee in Virginia, when his state, Tennessee, voted to leave the Union, Forrest went with his state, just as Lee had done. And he enlisted as a 40-year-old private in the Confederate Army. There was no snobbery or expecting a great rank or a political appointment by Forrest. He just wanted to do his part. And I'm sure at 40 years old as a private, some of the other young men in that cavalry company he enlisted in Memphis probably called him Pops or Grandpa or something like that. They didn't do it very long though. He knew Governor Isom G. Harris, and Governor Harris gave him a commission as a lieutenant colonel to raise a mounted battalion of cavalry at his own expense. The Confederate government couldn't pay for the saddle, the equipment, the weapons, anything like that. So Forrest used his own money to supply his troops. In 4 years of hard fighting, this middle-aged businessman who never spent a day at a military school like West Point, the Citadel, VMI, he rewrote the military history books on mounted warfare or mobile warfare. He never commanded more than about 9,000 men at one time, and that was right at the end of the war, and usually a lot less, around 3,000 to 5,000 in most of his campaigns. But by the end of the war, he had commanded over 60,000 men that were attached to his command, cavalry and infantry. He said, never stand to receive the attack of the enemy. Always take the initiative and get there first with the most men. It's one of the most simple but practical military maxims ever used in warfare, but it's also one of the most misquoted. He never said firstest with the mostest. He was not an English professor, but he had better language skills than that. But our South-hating and Forrest-hating critics will probably never let us hear the lastest of that. So anyway, so that all looks good in theory, but where'd this unknown lieutenant colonel, who was promoted by Governor Harris, proved to have a clear vision of how we should fight the war where the professionally trained generals were clueless in what was going on. In a recently published book on Forrest called Bust Held Wide Open by Dr. Samuel Mitchum of Louisiana, he said in the preface, in the Western theater of the war, the professionally trained West Point generals hardly ever won, while Forrest, the untrained amateur, hardly ever lost. So when did it start? Well, early in the war. February of 1862 at Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River above Nashville, In the military for less than a year, Forrest was ready to show that he had a better concept of professional soldiering than the high-powered generals who were fumbling away the defense of Middle Tennessee. Lieutenant Colonel Forrest and his small cavalry battalion delayed and harassed Grant's overland route from the fallen Fort Henry on the Tennessee River across to Fort Donelson at Dover, Tennessee on the Cumberland River, and reported to the officers there. Instead of being trapped in the fort, the Confederates decided to break out. On the morning of February 14th, they led a surprise attack against Grant's army that was encircling Fort Donelson. And Forrest was out there on the flank, capturing artillery and prisoners. And the plan was to open a road to Clarksville, Tennessee, and get the command out of there rather than have them trapped in this fort under siege conditions. So now they had a second option. Why not throw everybody they had into this attack? Grant's lines were already bent back into a sharp V. Throw everybody they had into the attack and drive Grant over the bluffs and into the Cumberland River. And that's what Forrest was pushing for. But the professional generals came up with a plan number three, a third idea. Let's go turn around, go back into the fort and surrender. And that's what they did that night. And they called Forrest in not to get his opinion because he was not a West Pointer, but to tell him that they were going to surrender him and his cavalry. And Forrest told them, I didn't bring my men here to surrender. We're going out of here tonight if we have to bust hell wide open. Be a good title for a book. Anyway, he did. He took his men out, about 600, and about 300 infantry climbed up and rode out double with them, and they got away. The next day, about 15,000 surprised Confederates were surrendered to unconditional surrender Grant. Well, what could 15,000 soldiers have done to defend Nashville, the first state capital that fell in the war? Or an additional 15,000, what would they have done to Grant down at Pittsburgh Landing in the battle in April? We go to that, to Shiloh, April of 1862. Again, Forrest's cavalry was on the flank, again capturing artillery and prisoners. Forrest and his scouts that night put on Union coats and crept along the riverbank to see Don Carlos Buell's reinforcements being ferried across the river to Grant. And he sent word back to the commanding officers that we need to either launch a night attack or be ready to launch an attack in the morning because we're going to be outnumbered tomorrow morning. And they did nothing. The next day, the outnumbered Confederates were driven from the field. July of 1862, his raid on Murfreesboro, Tennessee. U.S. General Don Carlos Buell marched toward the east-west railroad junction at Chattanooga. Forrest just swung around behind him, cut the railroad at Murfreesboro, cut out the telegraph lines, destroyed their supplies, and released civilian prisoners that were going to be executed that morning. They had rounded up civilians from the next county over, Cannon County, and they were going to execute them because they had been serving the enemy. Well, yeah, they were fathers of the boys in the army, and they'd given them food and clothing and horses. So he released those. And the jailer set fire to the jail and took off with the keys. So Forrest's men got in there and pried the doors open, got these civilians out of there, and then put out the fire and saved Murfreesboro from being burned down. But now Middle Tennessee State University doesn't want to have their ROTC building named Forrest Hall on their prestigious campus. But he saved them in the town. September of 1862, Bragg's Kentucky invasion. Forrest screened Bragg's flanking march around Buell so completely that the Northern general didn't know that a huge Confederate army was parked between him and Nashville and his supply base at Louisville. While all this was going on, Forrest and John Breckinridge captured the federal garrison at Munfordville, while Kirby Smith and Patrick Claiborne routed a federal army at the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky. Bragg, once again, was able to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, won a battle at Perryville, but then turned around and marched back into Tennessee. And that was the end of the Kentucky campaign. Forrest was furious at the wasted opportunity and wasted lives, and lives that the outnumbered Southern armies could ill afford to throw away. His criticism stung Bragg, who relieved him of his command and sent him back to raise a second cavalry command of the war in just over 12 months. December of 1862, the West Tennessee raid. Forrest takes his command of untrained, poorly armed, and poorly equipped raw recruits across the U.S. Patrol Tennessee River. and into the heavily garrisoned West Tennessee. He took out the Mobile, Ohio, and Ohio Railroad that ran down through West Tennessee and into Memphis, into Mississippi. Now, Grant's first attempt to take Vicksburg was a land route through Mississippi, central Mississippi, and then turn west and take Vicksburg from the land side on the east. With his railroad supply line gone and Earl Van Dorn had destroyed Grant's supply depot at Holly Springs, Grant decided to turn around and go back to Memphis and wait until the Federal Navy could protect his supply line down the Mississippi River. Forrest and his men fought over a dozen skirmishes, small battles, and captured over 1,300 prisoners, and they armed themselves with the best weapons that the U.S. government could supply, and affected the enemy's overall campaign, and he never fought Grant and his army head to head. He just simply went around behind him like he had done to Buell. June of 1863, the Tullahoma Campaign. After winning the first day's battle at Murfreesboro, Bragg fell back to a line along the Duck River in Middle Tennessee. And as Sam Watkins, 1st Tennessee, said in his book, Company H, bully for Bragg, he's hell on retreating. So they gave up that part of Middle Tennessee. William Rosecrans replaced Buell as the U.S. commander and maneuvered Bragg out of Tennessee and captured Chattanooga basically without firing a shot. He just maneuvered him out of there. The Army of Tennessee will not return to their native state for 15 months, and then under disastrous results under John Bell Hood. August of 1863, this is Forrest's strategic plan. He sent a letter to Adjutant General Samuel Cooper. He was the highest ranking officer in the Confederate military, higher than Robert E. Lee. Lee was commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, but Samuel Cooper was over the whole military. And he outlined a plan to take his cavalry into western Tennessee and western Kentucky and recruit men, and said if he had 2 batteries of long-range artillery, Dahlgren guns or 10-pound Parrott rifles, that he could shut down the Mississippi and Tennessee River and strand the Union armies that were in central Tennessee and now moving south of Chattanooga. Hearing nothing, Forrest then wrote directly to President Jefferson Davis, who forwarded the letter to Bragg for his opinion. Now, Bragg, who hated Forrest for telling the truth, advised against it, and Davis rejected the plan, and some historians say this may have been the worst decision in Davis's political career. September of 1863, Chickamauga. Once again in the thick of it from the start, Forrest opened the battle at this 3-day bloody battle at Reed's Bridge over Chickamauga Creek, and the Confederates win a smashing victory, routing the U.S. Army from the field, driving them back over Missionary Ridge and into Chattanooga. Forrest was hot on their heels, came up on Missionary Ridge, and they had a huge signal tower on Missionary Ridge. They got there so fast that the Union soldiers up on top of it couldn't get down fast enough. He captured them, ordered them to get down and use their telescope to look into Chattanooga and saw the confusion and disorganization of the Federal Army in Chattanooga. And he was sending couriers back to Bragg, wearing out horses, telling him to bring the army, bring the army. And Bragg sulked and sat around and did nothing because his plan hadn't been carried out. And so the Federal Army survived in Chattanooga, was reinforced by Grant and Sherman in November, drove the Confederates off of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge and back down into Georgia. Now, in his book, Dr. Mitchum quotes German General Erwin Rommel, "Never fight a battle when you gain nothing by winning it." And that was true of what happened after Chickamauga. All right. Let me see. Okay. Here. Then, because of his criticism of Bragg, Forrest then was transferred. Well, the results of Chickamauga were hard on the Confederates. They suffered over 18,400 casualties and killed, wounded, and missing. And Forrest was furious again. Why does he, Bragg, fight battles if he does nothing with the victory? And we said that the Federal Army survived, were reinforced, and drove them away. Bragg retaliated against Forrest for his criticism by taking his second command away from him for the war, gave it to someone else, and transferred Forrest west to the Department of Mississippi, Alabama, and Eastern Louisiana. So Forrest thought that other than getting away from Bragg, this was a pretty good deal. He assumed that he was being sent west to take out General Sherman's railroad supply line before the Yankee general can begin his campaign to take Atlanta. And what you have to remember is there were two railroad lines that Sherman was using. One was the Nashville and Decatur, and then went over to Bridgeport. And then the other one was the Nashville and Chattanooga, southeast to Chattanooga. Now, most of the supplies had to come over the Nashville and Decatur Railroad because going over Mont Eagle Mountain, remember, they didn't have big diesel engines back then. They couldn't pull a full train of ammunition and supplies over there. The Yankees used that route, Chattanooga back to Nashville, to send their empty boxcars and their wounded. So mainly, if he could take out the Nashville and Decatur, Sherman would be trapped in North Georgia with no supplies. They couldn't use the Tennessee River because of Muscle Shoals, and they couldn't get big steamboats up over the shoals in the summertime. They could in the winter, but the water was too low in the summer. So, but in just a little over a month, from November to December of 1863, Forrest raised his 3rd Cavalry Command from nothing, disorganized guerrilla bands, Confederate deserters, and young boys. He was promoted to Major General on December the 4th. Now, the U.S. Army had a better appreciation of Forrest than his own government did. Grant had been transferred east, and now Sherman commanded the Western U.S. Army. He was terrified that Forrest would get into Tennessee and take out the railroads and leave him with no supplies, stranded in North Georgia. Sherman had to depend on the railroads, as we said. In the spring and summer of 1864, 4 U.S. armies were sent out from Memphis into northern Mississippi to either kill, capture, or at least keep Forrest occupied, where he couldn't get out of Mississippi and get into Tennessee. February 1864, Okolona, Mississippi. Forrest defeated Sooy Smith's cavalry, was sent south to cover Sherman's advance out of Vicksburg through Meridian to Selma, Alabama. Sherman got as far as Meridian. He never could find out what happened to his cavalry. He wasn't going to be out there with Forrest somewhere around and no cavalry to protect him. So Sherman turned around and went back to Vicksburg. Then April of 64, 3rd West Tennessee raid. Forrest goes into West Tennessee to get horses for Abraham Buford's dismounted cavalry division. That's a nice way of saying they were just infantry. If you don't have a horse, you're infantry. Not knowing where Forrest will strike next, U.S. troops were held in Memphis and all along the Mississippi River. And we want to explain 1 or 2 of the battles that Forrest fought. This, in April of 1864, resulted in the battle at Fort Pillow. And the Forrest critics always say, well, that was where Forrest ordered the massacre of Negro troops at Fort Pillow. Fort Pillow was never mentioned in their operational orders. When they left Columbus, Mississippi, it was never mentioned. And for 5 weeks on this raid up through West Tennessee, all the way up to Paducah, Kentucky, Fort Pillow was never mentioned. It was not on their objective. It's when they had gotten the horses and they were coming back out of Tennessee at Trenton that he sent a report to his commanding officer in Mississippi, Stephen D. Lee. And once again, Fort Pillow wasn't mentioned. On April the 6th, he sent a supplementary order and said, we will attend to Fort Pillow. Now, what changed? Well, the civilians in West Tennessee asked him to do something about the Tennessee Tories and the blacks coming out of Fort Pillow and robbing the civilians in West Tennessee and attacking the women. Now, that's something you didn't do. Forrest said, men are fighting against men, you leave the women alone. And with that, he sent part of his command under James Chalmers west to take out Fort Pillow, which they did on April the 12th. The other thing they don't tell you is he gave the fort 3 chances to surrender, and they refused all 3 of them. So when his command came over the wall, they fired pistols and shotguns right into the face of the Union defenders. They broke and ran for the river. Fort Pillow was on a bluff, dropped off down to a road along the river on the Mississippi. Well, now you can't see that because the Mississippi's changed course. It's all trees and swamp below that bluff. But that's where most of the fighting took place after the Federals broke and ran from the earthen walls of the fort. So since they couldn't defeat Forrest on the battlefield, they came up with this propaganda that he was a massacre and ordered all these troops to be shot. So if he ordered a massacre, he didn't do a very good job of it. They took out 260 prisoners. That's not a definition of a massacre. In April of 1864, Forrest sent another letter to President Davis proposing to hit Sherman's railroad supply lines in Tennessee. Now, Forrest never had enough men to confront Sherman or Grant or any of these other armies head to head, but he knew how to stop a much larger force, cut off their supply of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and forage for their livestock. It had worked before against Buell, Grant, Rosecrans, and Sherman. After the disaster at Chattanooga, Bragg had been kicked upstairs as a military advisor to the president. Davis referred his letter to Bragg, and of course his senior military advisor, Braxton Bragg, turned it down. Once again, the enemy's government has a better respect and a better fear of Forrest than his own people. June of 1864, Bryce's Crossroads, northern Mississippi. This has been called the perfect battle. Forrest, with 3,800 men, defeated an army of over 8,000. And not only did he defeat them, he routed them off the field, captured 20 of their 22 pieces of artillery, and captured all 250 of their wagons that they were using to raid the farms in Mississippi. It took General Sturgis 2 weeks to get from Memphis down to Bryce's Crossroad. Only took him about 2 days to get back, since he only had about half the number of men going back that came out and no artillery or wagons to slow them down. This was also called the first tank battle. And you're going, wait a minute, Andrews, tanks didn't come along until World War I, 1914. But what Forrest and his artillery did under Captain John Morton and Captain Rice, they would load their cannons with double charges of canister and roll them up within 50 yards of the Federal lines and literally blast holes in the Federal lines, and then the dismounted cavalry troopers would come in behind them. And basically that's what a tank does. It's just a tracked vehicle with an artillery piece on it, blasts holes in the enemy lines, and then the infantry comes through behind it. And there are rumors, and they've never really proved it whether it did or didn't happen, that 2 German officers came over here in the 1930s to study Forrest. One was Erwin Rommel, and the other one was Hans Guderian, who was actually the father of the modern Blitzkrieg. And there are people in Mississippi that have said, oh yeah, my grandmother said she talked to these German officers. So you want to know where the panzer tactics for the German army came from? It came from Forrest in northern Mississippi. July of 1864, the battle at Harrisburg. Under the command of Stephen D. Lee, the Confederates suffered heavy losses in a poorly executed attack, but the Yankees panicked and retreated back to Memphis. August of 1864, the Memphis raid. Facing a much larger army this time, Forrest swung around behind them and launched a surprise raid right into downtown Memphis. General Smith's invading army has to turn back to Memphis to protect the armchair generals that are hanging out there. September of 1864, northern Alabama. Forrest has finally turned loose on Sherman's railroad lines, but it's too little and too late. November of 1864, Forrest is in West Tennessee once again on the west bank of the Tennessee River, where he placed his artillery up on Pilot's Knob and fired down across the river into Johnsonville on the east side of the river, destroyed boats, steamboats, barges, warehouses, approximately $8 million worth of supplies on the east side of the river. November through December of 1864, Hood's Tennessee campaign. Ordered to cover John Bell's attempt to capture Nashville, Forrest crossed at Florence, headed north, and spread out in front of the Army of Tennessee coming home. In clashes with James Wilson's Federal cavalry, Forrest gives the Federals usually a severe beating on an almost daily basis, driving the Federal cavalry out of the way. General John Schofield was sent south out to Nashville to delay Forrest for 2 to 3 months. He only delayed him about 3 weeks. And Spring Hill, the Forrest had gotten around behind the Federal Army, had position at Thompson Station, but his men were running out of ammunition. They'd fought all day, and they were down to 1 or 2 rounds apiece. The Confederate Army was disorganized under Hood. They failed to block the road, and that night, Schofield's entire Army Corps literally tiptoed right past the Confederates and escaped to Franklin. Next day, November the 30th, battle at Franklin. Against the advice of all of his commanders, Hood decided to attack an entrenched enemy south of the town of Franklin, and then both flanks were anchored on the Harpeth River. Forrest offered to swing around behind him. Now, Forrest was the only officer there that had been in this area of Middle Tennessee before. He fought all through there in March of 1863, March and April. Battle at Thompson Station, he captured Brentwood. He'd actually threatened some of the defenses around Nashville. They even stopped and were fed by some of the ladies at the Hermitage. on the grounds of the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home. And he knew that all the roads, small hog tracks, whatever around there, he offered to swing around behind the Army, put with one division of infantry with their artillery, put them in the gap at Hollow Tree Gap. And even today, the road kind of twists and turns going up over those hills. Put the infantry there and his cavalry on either flanks. And as Forrest told Hood, he said, this time we'll put the cork in the bottle. But Hood didn't want to listen to him and ordered a suicidal attack over 2 miles of open ground against the Federal works at Franklin. Hood made the problem even worse. He split up Forrest's cavalry division. Forrest had 3 divisions under James Chalmers, Abraham Buford, and William Red Hicks. And in Hood's infinite wisdom, he split them up, put Chalmers way over on the left flank of the Confederate Army during the Battle of Franklin, where they did practically nothing. And now Forrest just had 2 divisions to try to get across the Harpeth River and force the Federal cavalry away. And they were back and forth all that afternoon of the 30th, but Forrest never got around behind them. December 1864, moving up the road to Nashville, Forrest placed his artillery under Major D.C. Kelly on the Cumberland River west of Nashville. Now, from December the 2nd until the opening shots of the Battle of Nashville on the morning of December 15th, Colonel Kelly and his artillery fought 19 different battles on the Cumberland River, but no Federal ship got past them and into Nashville. In another poor decision, Hood sends his best fighting officer on the field away to Murfreesboro to capture a supply depot over there. But the Federals didn't know that Forrest wasn't on the field. And James Wilson and the Federal cavalry delayed and delayed and delayed, had all kind of excuses why they couldn't come out of these fortifications around Nashville and attack Forrest. They even raided a circus that was performing in Nashville, took all the circus horses away from them. So finally, on December 15th, they launched the attack, and Thomas destroyed Hood's army in front of Nashville. Forrest heard about Hood's defeat, cut across country from Murfreesboro to Columbia, and then was assigned the rear guard of covering Hood's retreat back down toward the Tennessee River. Under Forrest, like Napoleon's old guard at Waterloo, he saved the barefoot, freezing, starving army of Tennessee till he could get across the Tennessee River. So how many times did Forrest tell the professional West Point generals how to win battles? They ignored him and we lost. How many times did Forrest write to the Confederate government on showing how to stop a much larger army? And he actually showed how to do it. This was not theory, and changed the course of the war in the Western theater of the Confederacy. They ignored him, and today we must live in the enemy's country, listen to their rewritten version of history, and see our monuments and memorials torn down and grave sites vandalized. President Davis, after the war, admitted that he was misled by Bragg, among others, and saw Forrest as only a very successful raider in small operations. But Forrest saw the big picture, the overall full-dimensional concept of the war the Confederate government couldn't see. Only his enemies recognized Forrest's threat to their overall planning, and he was never recognized by his own people until it was too late. So thank you very much. If y'all have any questions, we'd be glad to answer them for you, or make up something that sounds good. Thank you.
Political aspirations.
Sir?
Political aspirations, John Forrest, you never really.
No. Now, before the war, he was an alderman, city council in Memphis. He had traveled all over the South. He, as a slave dealer, and that's another thing they yap about Forrest. Oh, he sold slaves. Well, okay, it was a legal profession. You could have been worse than been one of Forrest's slaves, because he never broke up a family. He'd actually buy people back that had been separated. When the war came along, he told his slaves, if you will go with us and serve during the war, regardless of the outcome of the war, I'll give you your freedom. And so they needed teamsters, they needed blacksmiths, harness makers, carpenters, everything they did before. So they went with him. About the third time he was wounded, he called them all together and said, boys, I don't think I'm gonna make it to the end of the war. You're free to go now. I promised Mrs. Forrest you get your freedom. I'll sign the papers for you, but we really need your help if you could stick it out. And 44 out of the 45 stayed with him. But like I said, he had traveled all over the South in the slave business. He knew Governor Harris, a lot of the politicians, but he never really, I don't think he had much respect for politicians. He didn't want any part of it.
Pretty much around the South. I mean, he was a common man, probably been in the papers with his business around.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, I thought it was very interesting when you were talking about at Rice's Crossroads where, the tactics the Confederates were using to bust up the Federal alliance and stuff, and it was paint like as you described. And then you were talking about Generals Rommel and somebody else, visiting Mississippi.
Yes, sir.
And you said that there could have been some inspiration there. Is there any,
There's no really written hard facts on that.
I heard the Germans turret on motorcycles.
but I guess what I'm at, is there any quotes by German personnel that might?
Now, you know, Rommel had to commit suicide. They implicated him in the plot to have Hitler executed. He was given the choice of either committing suicide or they were going to kill his family. So he committed suicide. So we don't have nothing from Rommel. Some of this came from his son, that he thought that this had happened, but there's no definitive writings on that. So, okay. Well, thank y'all very much. Appreciate it.